Hello, you're watching Innovation Africa, where we explore innovative ways to address Africa's big economic and social issues. I'm Wole Famurewa, and thank you for tuning in. More than half of Africa's population lacks access to electricity. Now, this highlights one of the biggest economic challenges, but also a huge opportunity for discerning investors. In today's program, we look at the smart thinking required to tackle Africa's power deficit, looking at the big issues in policy making and the approach of investors to the market opportunity. Joining me to examine power reforms in Africa is a great panel of investors and operators in Africa's energy sector. Solomon Adegbie-Quaynor is the country manager for Nigeria at the International Finance Corporation. Alli is the CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation. And lastly, Lazarus Angbazo is the president and CEO for General Electric Nigeria. I started by asking Lazarus his thoughts on privatization as a policy tool to catalyze power reforms on the continent.
We are sitting in the biggest privatization market on the continent, if not in the world. Right. It was really important that the government did this, and I think the effect of it is that it has unlocked a whole new industry now. I mean, I think it is assessed to be one of the most ambitious, most successful, and at this point quite irreversible in terms of the scale of what they've done. They've unlocked the sector. You have about 10 or so generating companies right now. You've got about 11 distribution companies. A lot of these are operating. Of the first phase, they are actually getting paid, so which is good. A lot of the funding for this was local, which is good. And now the phase 2 of the privatization is about to be completed as well, with the preferred bidders actually already named. Right. So I think as a tool for advancing the economic and infrastructure development, I think the government has been pretty successful doing it here in Nigeria. Right.
Solomon, I'll get your thoughts on that point as well. The IFC, of course, has seen power reforms across the world. What are your thoughts on the privatization that we're seeing, not just in Nigeria, but across the rest of the continent?
I mean, so privatization is really one of the ways in which you can bring private sector participation, but it doesn't always have to be privatization. So I think what has been good for Nigeria is privatization, but what's more important is really to create a right enabling environment to bring private sector participation, because we also are looking at people entering into greenfield IPP projects as well. So the more important thing is really the enabling environment, and simplicity is really the key. Because ultimately, it's a regulated business, and investors coming into this business want certainty. So the innovations that take place to create certainty or simplicity, like in the case of Nigeria, the establishment of the bulk trader, right. These are the key things that we always want to see. And we have to look at privatization or private sector participation customized to each market. And the whole idea is to, provide simplicity, create a little more certainty in the enabling environment.
Right. Andrew, we're focusing on innovation on this program. Your thoughts about privatization as a tool? Solomon just alluded to the fact that it's not the only way. And if we look across the world, I think it's been a mix of privatization and government actually taking the first step in driving power sector reforms. What are your thoughts on this point?
Well, I think there are different models, and different models can work in different circumstances. So if you look across the African continent, South Africa is still, power in South Africa is still delivered by Eskom, which is a state-owned company, whereas Kenya, for example, has a very successful private sector, although with government involvement, structure. And this has worked very well over the past 15 years, right, since they've brought IPPs into that market. Nigeria again is trying a very private sector solution, which I think is what is right for this country. Right. So I think that there's no one formula, and as Solomon said, really what is important today is how you can get large quantities of power to as many people as possible, right, and as cheaply as possible.
Right, but if I stay with you, Andrew, just reviewing the success stories across the continent, you just talked about South Africa. We know it's leading the way in terms of generation, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Your thoughts about the success stories we can look for as you invest across the continent? Nigeria, of course, is really just kicking off its process. So your thoughts on the success stories that we can learn from and the innovations that you saw in policy making there?
Yeah, well, you mentioned South Africa, but I have to say that, even in South Africa, there are concerns about the quantity of electricity that's available and whether they're going to have blackouts. So it's not been 100% successful, although they have very successful sectors. So for example, what's called the refit program in terms of bringing in renewable power has been quite successful in South Africa. Personally, I like the Kenya market. I think one of the main things about Kenya is that the tariffs that are charged to end users actually reflect the actual cost of generating power. If you look across the African continent, most countries do not meet this fundamental standard. If what the users are paying does not cover the cost of power, then that means that there needs to be some kind of subsidy somewhere along the chain.
And that doesn't always,
that is very unstable, because even if a government can manage a subsidy today, as countries grow, both in terms of population and in terms of economic size, the amount of power consumed will inevitably increase, and therefore the quantum of the subsidy will also increase, and therefore what may work today, given a specific size or power sector, probably won't work in the future. So what you want to do is to develop a system where that system is self-sustaining. This is very possible in power. I mean, there's some sectors which, like rail transportation, which need to have subsidies, but power doesn't. And I think this is a very important thing. And I think this was the fundamental step that the Kenyans did, which is very different from many other countries.
Solomon, I want to bring you into this conversation and talk about the importance of integrated planning, because when I speak to analysts, investors, and they look at Nigeria's power reforms, one point that they tend to bring up is maybe a lack of planning with respect to the various aspects of these reforms. I mean, of course, we know that Nigeria is really driven by gas in terms of as the energy source for these reforms. So talk to us about how you view the importance of planning, especially as you invest across the continent.
I mean, so planning is actually very important, and I wouldn't say that in the case of Nigeria there hasn't been good planning. The power sector reforms, as we have realized them today, are really as a result of good planning. But when it comes to diversification of fuel sources, I think the focus naturally is gas, because we have 183 trillion scf of gas. So this naturally should be a gas market. But yes, there will be the potential to look at, renewables. There will be the potential to look at, other, sources of fuel. And so when it comes to that broader planning, there's more that could be done, or there's more that could be articulated. But I do think that, the whole wholesale privatization that Nigeria has gone through actually should be commended. Now, when it comes to really other models of integrated planning or good planning, Andrew mentioned Kenya. In my case, I kind of like Cote d'Ivoire, because this is an example really of a market that continues to be attractive to private sector investors, notwithstanding really the civil war. And part of the reason for that is there was good planning, there was a good enabling environment. Tariffs, as Andrew said, were cost reflective, and government honored its commitments all the way through. And that is really the example that should be modeled.
Right. Andrew, I want to hear your thoughts on this point on planning. I wonder if you agree totally with Solomon that the way it's been constructed in Nigeria, because when I speak to analysts, many people say it should be a chain. I mean, for instance, something like the petroleum industry bill is still stuck in Parliament right now. It is a key part, an enabler for these reforms in Nigeria. And it hasn't been sorted out, so as a result, it's not fully integrated in the reforms we're seeing right now.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is actually really, in a way, an implementation issue, not a planning issue.
Okay.
I think when the reform was being planned, and I think we have to give Professor Bartonaji, who was the advisor and then the Minister of Power, a lot of credit for this. They deliberately looked at an end-to-end solution. So there was a piece on gas and gas pricing in particular, which was uncompetitive, and then they went across the whole value chain down to the end user and tariffs. And there's what's called the MITO, which is to try and bring these cost reflective tariffs that I mentioned. So I think the planning was actually there. Now, the question mark is, has everything that was in the plan been implemented? And I think that, you know, there's been a different speed at which different things have been implemented. So, but those, I think, refer mainly to execution issues, not necessarily planning issues.
Okay, Lazarus, I want to bring you in here. I think when you look at dealing with issues relating to infrastructure, everyone expects some, to a large extent, the shaking of hands between the private sector and the public sector. I know General Electric in particular has a model in this respect. You're doing something called a country-to-company agreement with the government, and then I want to just hear your thoughts on the importance of the private sector and the public sector getting involved in driving this reform, especially on the policy level.
I think it's key. I mean, the partnership is absolutely important. You know, first of all, in a country-company agreement, in the case of Nigeria, this was the government's idea, so you got to give them credit for even thinking about it. And the idea is, how do you actually align the commercial interests of companies like GE with the priorities and the requirements and the needs of a country like Nigeria? And so they basically laid out a roadmap and said, guys, if you work on the infrastructure solutions, you bring in local content, you facilitate financing, and you bring in training, then there's going to be a perfect alignment in terms of helping the country achieve its economic goals. So this is what we've done here in Nigeria, and further cascaded it to the particular sectors, you know, where we've kind of identified specific projects and goals, such as what you referred to, the MOU in power, the MOU in healthcare, and the rest of the sectors. So there are a few companies that have done this, along with GE, and we've done it not just in Nigeria, we've done it in Kenya, we've done it in Ghana as well. So that alignment and that partnership at the macro infrastructure level, you've got to have that. And otherwise, the enabling environment, such as Solomon mentioned, will really not be there, and we'll just keep waiting for you know, projects that really kind of fit a particular kind of scope, you know, that companies are interested in doing.
I want to leave this open to everyone. I mean, when you look at public private partnerships across the continent, how is that working? And are there things you think we should be tweaking in the way we approach this? Clearly, we know we definitely have to bring the private sector into sorting out this power sector deficit. So your thoughts on that point? I want to start with maybe Lazarus. I want to share some thoughts on that.
Well, I want to go back to the comment earlier about, you know, lessons learned. I mean, if you look at the Nigeria Power story over the last 8 to 10 years, you know, which is where it really started in 2005, you think about the key building blocks that have been established: establishment of the Act, establishment of NERC, establishment of bulk trader, and then the privatization kicked in, and then you now have projects, plans that have been handed over to private sectors, operating and getting paid, and IPPs that have been created as a result of the framework. So what has been accomplished here, right? You've got a framework that is pretty clear in terms of the rules of the game. You've got a fairly transparent and predictable, and by some measures, a very attractive tariff regime. Right, so that's good. And the outcome of that is an industry now that it's still very infant, it's still a small industry, a young industry, but with tremendous potential of creating wealth. You know, right before our eyes, we're seeing a lot of new companies being created, and even within that sector alone, right? Forget for a moment the cascading effect in manufacturing, in agriculture, in the other consumer areas. So I think it's really important for us to appreciate the scope of what has already been done. Obviously, a lot of bumps, you know, as we've witnessed, and more to come. But this is a process now that we think is irreversible, and I think we should just stay the course.
You want to share some thoughts, Andrew, on PPPs across Africa? Maybe some of the success stories you've seen, the elements that have really driven success where it has worked.
Unfortunately, I don't think that one could really say that PPPs across Africa as a class have been very successful. And the reason I would say this is the following. I think most of the individual PPPs have been successful in that you've had, you know, a power plant created. There are very few, if any, that have not been able to meet their financial obligations. So at a micro level, you can say that they're quite successful. And you can mention projects like Bujagali, Sendu in Senegal, Bujagali is in Uganda, and a number of projects, for example, in Kenya, Savo Power being just one. But on a macro basis, when you look at the fact that, for example, the average IPP in Africa takes 7 years to close. When you look at the costs involved in, the sort of costs around legal issues, around financing, of bringing each of these PPPs or IPPs into operation, they're not really making a significant impact on the power needs of the African continent. And that's why I say broadly it hasn't been a success in my view.
Why do you think it hasn't worked? Is it something that doesn't really work for power? Is that what you would suggest?
No, I think,
or is it just...
I think one of the reasons is, and there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is a lack of standardization. So every single deal or every single IPP is almost like starting from scratch, and you're renegotiating all the contracts, from scratch, and all that takes a long time. If we were able to bring in a much more formulaic thing with standardized templates, and ideally standardized templates which apply to more than one African country, although that's very difficult, then that should at least speed up the process. But that is difficult for many different reasons. I think the other issue that takes a lot of time on these IPPs, again, comes back to what I was saying about non-cost reflective tariffs. Because the tariffs aren't cost reflective, the entities, which are generally state-owned power companies that are buying the power from these IPPs, are not bankable. And therefore, the people who are lending money to these IPP projects need some sort of guarantee or support from the government for this.
So that subsidy makes it a bit of a challenge.
And that makes it more of a challenge, because then you get bogged down in what sort of support do you need. Often you then have to go offshore to get support from the World Bank Group through partial risk guarantees, which are good, but they add time and complexity to the projects. So I think those are two very good reasons.
Very interesting points you're making there. Solomon, I want to hear about the potential to make these power reforms an industry. We've seen, for instance, in Nigeria, a telecom industry has emerged because of the regulation in the late 90s. Your thoughts about policy making in that respect, the fact that this is an opportunity for Africa to address its poverty issues, its economic growth issues. The power sector itself and the reforms that we're seeing there is actually an opportunity.
So Nigeria has the potential to be the largest private power market in the world, okay? As we've all said, very ambitious privatization or private sector participation, power reforms. And so the potential to really support it, from various industries, including General Electric, but then also groups that could manufacture, smart meters, prepaid meters, and also service it. So the linkage industries are potentially huge. However, when we talk about public-private partnerships, once again, it's not so much a project, but it's really a process to working together. So as long as the public sector and the private sector continue to work together and solve the value chain issues, the potential is huge, whether it's on the gas-based side, whether it's really on the transmission side, whether it's on the distribution side, because ultimately everybody wants an affordable and reliable service. We're ultimately individually paying far more than the regulated tariffs, when we self-generate our own power. So bridging what we're paying and also what's going to be provided, from an on-grid basis, and being sure that everybody feels they have value for money is what we need to get together as really the public sector and the private sector to ensure.
Right. Lazarus, your thoughts on this point about creating an industry from these power reforms?
It is what we're witnessing right now, obviously. I can think about examples where, in partnership with governments, Lagos State government is a good example for that. They're looking at, how do you create a waste to power industry? And if you think about Lagos State, we've got about 20 million people, but an individual creates about half a kilogram of waste every day, right? You multiply that by the population, you've got a huge amount of waste already that is convertible into some sort of fuel, gas fuel, to produce gas, to produce power. And by a very simple calculation, you can see the amount of power that can be unlocked from an industry like waste in Lagos, can be significant. Now that has tremendous benefits, right? Obviously, it will create clean environment, it will create incentive to continue to actually keep the city clean, but also it really unlocks the capacity in that sector to be able to actually fund a number of the small industries in Lagos State. I mean, this is a huge opportunity. So there are a number of examples like that, right. That you can see where a partnership between a public sector institution like a government, and operators like ourselves, right. And others as well, and financing institutions like AFC and IFC can create the right sort of momentum in really leveraging the reform in power and translating it into incremental economic activity.
All right. Hold that thought, Lazarus. Yeah. We'll come back to you after the break. We head into a short break now. And when we come back, we continue our discussion about innovation in Africa's power sector reforms. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our conversation about innovation in Africa's power sector reforms. Still with me are Lazarus Angbazo, the CEO of General Electric Nigeria, Andrew Alli, the CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, and Solomon Adegbie-Quaynor, the country manager of the IFC in Nigeria. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. So I want us to shift gear a little bit. We've talked a bit about how this can create an industry. But now let's begin to talk about the micro issues here. I mean, one issue I think that will be interesting to talk about is the importance of scale, whether it's important or not. Because, for instance, in Nigeria, we've seen huge projects, we're seeing huge power plants being sold, but then some suggest that perhaps another way to go is to go into smaller micro-type projects. Lazarus, let me start with you. Your thoughts on that point?
No, and I think that is happening here in Nigeria for sure. If you think about what the install base in Nigeria is, there's about 10 gigawatts of power on the grid. There's another estimate of another 10 that is off-grid. And this is largely in captive segments, in industrial consumer markets like cement, like food and beverage. And of course, there's a lot of self-generation going on as well. So for that segment, we estimate that over 50% of what Nigeria needs is going to be actually targeted at that segment as well, where you've got power projects of 50 megawatts or below. So there is demand for that. And actually, it is almost a necessity to support that segment because the big projects cannot all be carried on the national grid, as we all know. Right. I mean, there's a lot of degradation going on there, and it's going to take a while before you fix that. So you have the opportunity for these captive industries to self-generate. You've got distribution networks right now that they can completely bypass the infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure, and actually create generation embedded within their distribution networks and pretty much put it to end users. So this is an area that we're very excited about, and I think you can see this replicated in many other countries as well.
Solomon, do you agree? I mean, some, for instance, suggest that it may not make too much sense in going small. It's always good to go big. Do you agree with that?
With Lazarus next to me, I have to say partly it's good to go big. No, but what we have some energy and equipment solutions for the large grid projects, but we also have some solutions for smaller projects, but still very efficient. Okay, so there are some equipment suppliers.
So efficient, does that mean profitable?
Yes,
it could work.
It could work. This is where, for the same amount of gas or less amount of gas, you can still produce, an equal amount of power. And this would be very important as we look at the off-grid solutions, as as Lazarus mentioned. And I think we have to keep in mind that we're looking at energy solutions, right? We don't have enough power in the grid, and even with all the mega projects coming up, it's not going to be ready tomorrow. And so we have to look at really ways in which we can supply power in the meantime. So some off-grid solar, would be good to look at. Some mini hydros in some cases. For example, in the north where we have dams for both agricultural purposes, we can harness also the potential for power. But let's also not forget the poorest people. They're looking for energy solutions. They're not looking necessarily to always have it come through a pipe into the home. So we need to think about solar lanterns, solar cook stoves. I mean, the solar lanterns where you can also charge your phone, since most of them have telephones, is very important. So we need to look at really the space of energy solutions, and we need to look at it from a phased approach.
Andrew, your thoughts on that point?
Well, I'm sort of with Solomon. I think that the technology has certainly improved. So 50 years ago, you needed to have a certain size of power station to get the energy efficiency from whatever fuel it was that you were burning. Now with advances in technology, you can get the same sort of megawatts per gas unit from much smaller engines, and I think GE have been leaders in this, if I can be nice to Lazarus.
Good point. I think they have.
But I also think that when you're looking at power solutions, the efficiency of the technology is only one part. And actually, when you look at the overall cost of a power project, it's actually it's the largest probably, but actually a relatively a smaller part than you may think. And the cost of financing, the legal costs and all that also add up, and therefore there is still an economy of scale, I believe, in power projects. Now, a lot of those additional costs, if you've got a big cement plant that needs a power plant, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, a lot of those additional costs are not there. But when you start to try and put smaller power plants onto distribution networks, have them sell to third parties, you start to get those costs and you start to lose the efficiency. So I believe that really to make a difference, to move the dial on power problems in Africa and certainly in Nigeria, you do need to look at some of these mega projects and large-scale projects, and I don't think that you should sacrifice them for the smaller projects. Now, as Solomon said, you also need to look at other energy solutions for people who are off-grid, and we need to remember that it's still a minority of people in Nigeria who are actually on the power grid. So
in fact, the rest of Africa, really.
Well, yes. So those kind of things, I think, will be important actually for some time to come, which is a bit unfortunate because we'd like everybody to be on the grid, but we have to fill that gap in the interim.
But looking at, especially from your experience, Andrew, if you can just very quickly touch this point, the opportunities for other energy sources to be injected in these reforms we're seeing across Africa. We see in Nigeria, yes, it's so skewed towards gas, and it makes sense because, yes, we have so much of it, but then we see the problems we're having with that right now. It really shows the need to diversify. But from your experience across Africa, investing across the continent, your thoughts on other energy sources and how efficient they are in this market?
Well, again, what energy source is most efficient depends very much on the circumstances of the country or the area involved. So, for example, we AFC financed a wind power project in Cape Verde, which is providing today about 20% of the power for the whole country. Now, generally speaking, wind is actually quite an expensive solution relative to other types of fuel. But in this particular case, given the circumstances of Cape Verde, where the alternative really was to import diesel for diesel-fired power plants, this is actually the best solution for that. On the other hand, if you're sitting in a country that has coal reserves, or you're sitting in a country that has gas reserves, then those may be the best solutions. If you want to but having said that, I agree with you that some sort of diversification is also important. So if you take Nigeria, for example, we do in Nigeria have large coal reserves in the middle part of the country. And coal, is, although not the most environmentally friendly, is actually quite a cheap source of power. And, there are technologies now to make it more efficient and cleaner. And those coal fields are actually located relatively close to power sources and on the other side of the country from where most of the gas is. So, looking at coal-fired power plants in the middle of Nigeria, serving the north and Abuja and places like that, I think could make a lot of sense.
I think, Lazarus, if we can bring you in here, another area that I think investors and possibly even policymakers should begin to look more closely at, although I hear that to some extent it's been addressed in the policies and the reforms that we have in Nigeria, is tapping from the excesses of the large corporates like the Dangote, for instance. Dangote, I recall speaking to him about 2 years ago, and he suggested to me that he actually can produce power cheaper than he can get it off the grid. So he has that excess capacity that we can bring into the grid in Nigeria. Your thoughts about that point?
Well, again, someone like that, he can actually do it, but the challenge again is, the balance of the infrastructure that is needed to actually wheel the power from his side onto the main grid.
Right.
Now, who's going to bear the cost of that?
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of people who have also talked on the gas side. I mean, how do you actually build a gas infrastructure pipeline that actually will provide a feedstock to build, owned or captive power projects that then can be made available to the grid? So I think in the case of Nigeria, obviously the demand is so huge, and our view is that there needs to be a very diversified source of fuel to actually leverage the full capacity that we need here. Now, in the long run, obviously, the market is still young. The economics of the business itself is going to determine which of these sort of fuel types is going to dominate, right? I mean, obviously, it's pretty obvious to most people that they've got a lot of gas. You also have a lot of hydro. You've got waste, you've got diesel, you've got coal, to Andrew's point, and they're all needed right now, at least to actually take the industry from where it is to the point where now the real economics of the business takes over and then determines incremental, marginal investments in the sector.
Right, Solomon, I want you to speak to the point he made there. He made a point about who's going to pay for it if we're going to evacuate that power from the likes of the Dangotes into where it's more needed. So your thoughts about that as an opportunity for investors, given the reforms you're seeing in Nigeria right now?
I mean, so transmission is really the evacuation method, and these would tend to be high voltage lines. Today, the transmission company of Nigeria is owned public sector, but it's managed by the private sector. So there's a potential to actually create PPPs in the transmission network that could bring in private investor, but also private capacity to rapidly build out the needed transmission infrastructure. So, those are some of the opportunities. But just going back to, the other points you raised, we have a lot of industry that have built redundant generation capacity, including gas fueled, over the last several years. We have to find ways to harness it because that could really be stranded, capacity, and they already have the common infrastructure. So the ability to expand production really from those sources and then connect that to the grid or into mini distribution systems, is also greatly there. Then in terms of the question you had posed to Andrew, we shouldn't look at really our production from a country perspective. We need to start to look at things from a regional dimension. So the power pools are very important, and this is where the transmission infrastructure and the interconnections begins to make us take a look really at maybe we should be working on the INGA, because that brings hydro, clean fuel. Okay.
So INGA is a project in...
And INGA it's a key project that brings in the hydro fuel. That's a DRC.
DRC, right.
I thought everybody had heard about
INGA.
Actually,
that is that massive project.
Yes, exactly. So maybe we should be thinking about INGA to bring hydro. Then we think of Nigeria to bring gas. Then we think of other countries that may have very good coal fuel, like Mozambique, to bring coal. But we should look at this more from a regional perspective as opposed to a country perspective. And the cost and the affordability also factor in when you look at it from a pooled regional perspective.
Andrew, I want to hear your thoughts on this point. I mean, he just talked about INGA, massive project being in Central Africa there. But we spoke earlier about small projects versus large projects, and that, of course, is a huge one. Looking at a region like West Africa, for instance, the opportunities to make massive projects that could feed the rest of the region. Your thoughts on that point, given the energy sources that we have in this region?
Well, I think it's entirely viable from at least a theoretical basis. You already
what has to come together for it to work?
You already have the West Africa power pool, which is providing the transmission capacity, and frankly, there are already cross-border sales of power. I think one of the potential, at least, bottlenecks on this is a political one, which is, if you take Nigeria, we have a huge power deficit in Nigeria. People are already upset that Nigeria sells power to Niger and other neighboring countries who allegedly get more regular power than people in Nigeria. So,
but then, of course, many of these countries are connected. I mean, the River Niger, for instance, crosses so many countries.
No, but the point I'm making is that, so if Nigeria is building a big power plant for export, in today's environment, a lot of people are likely to be unhappy with that, because they'll be saying, well, shouldn't we be, charity begins at home, shouldn't we be, sorting out our domestic problem? So I think that is one of the bottlenecks or hurdles to going to the pooled solution, which frankly is ultimately where we should be going. And in this case, I think Nigeria isn't the best example, but most of the other countries in West Africa are pretty small. And therefore, you know, a sort of good-sized power plant may be too big for any individual country, but in terms of efficiency, maybe the best way to go.
Right.
So theoretically, pools are certainly the best way.
Right.
But I think there are a lot of political and practical obstacles today.
Solomon, I want to get your thoughts. Oh, Larry, Lazarus, you had some thoughts to that?
To Andrew's point, I mean, the execution challenges of getting some of these projects off the ground is unbelievable. You know, the idea of doing such a big project, okay, so how do you develop the project to begin with? And what we're saying is that the capacity to actually even put a well-developed executable project is very difficult. You've got to actually, these fully backed projects, they don't exist anymore. You've got to develop it. The financing is very difficult to get all the people together. The capacity to operate when it's already built, yeah, right? It's also something that we're seeing a huge lack in. So the human capital requirements, you know, to actually get a project like this off the ground and then run it, you know, it's something that is the largest elephant in the room, in most rooms, you know, in most policy offices where they're talking about such projects. So, I mean, in theory, it's wonderful. When it comes to actual execution and implementation, that's where you see a lot of these projects dying.
Right, right. Okay, so let's move to the smaller projects now. Okay. Solomon, your thoughts on this point? Special situations, rural community projects. I know the IFC is really driven to get such projects off the ground. The opportunity for investors to focus on that. I want to get your thoughts on that point. It may not be as attractive or as sexy as moving into large cities like Lagos, for instance, but there is still an opportunity. There is a demand in those places.
I mean, so a lot of those places, it doesn't make sense to necessarily connect to the main grid. So off-grid solutions, you know, would make sense. And in some cases, the fuel source is not the traditional fuel source like gas, etc., but it would be solar renewables. But still, in that case, it's important to have the enabling environment. We need to have the cost-reflective feed-in tariffs for renewables. So if that has not been set by the regulator, it's still difficult to look at those projects. But the opportunity to do off-grid renewables, solar, in some cases wind, as you know, as Andrew has you know, done in Cape Verde. I'm not suggesting that Cape Verde is rural, you know, but you know, the opportunity to do that, you know, if the right you know, regulatory environment is in place, it would be attractive to investors. I mean, we think the potential to do that in northern Nigeria is there. So notwithstanding the security issues, you know, those would be opportunities one would look at, but security definitely would be a concern.
Right, okay. I want us to switch gear a little bit now, and I'll begin to talk about the importance of technology in driving reforms in this power sector. I want to start with you. General Electric, of course, has a huge track record in bringing technology to bear. The light bulb, of course, starts with you guys. Okay, so talk about technology and how that is changing the face of reforms across the continent.
Well, the technology flexibility that we're seeing today is just so encouraging, quite frankly. You know, I mean, I did give the example of the waste to power. That's a technology that is relatively new, but it's not been fully deployed in a number of places. We have an example in South Africa. We just did one in Dubai. It can be done here, and we've got huge waste problems. We've got the energy storage technology that is now being deployed. I think the telecom companies are using it a lot to reduce their cost of electricity by saving on fuel cost, you know, diesel and whatnot, you know, and now the utilities are actually using it as well in order to actually increase reliability and backup opportunities. So there's that good technology supporting as well. You know, even in the small scale projects, I mean, we're seeing a lot of innovation in technology in that area. I mean, the US Africa Development Foundation actually, in partnership with GE, actually launched an innovation challenge, you know, for off-grid solutions for small projects. A good example would be one that a group in River State created a solar panel project, you know, that is able to actually fund and provide electricity for 140 families. Afe Babalola did something similar in the university, where they're actually doing a hybrid hydro project, that is actually going to provide electricity for about 10,000 members of that community. So you've got examples of that, and we're doing something similar in Kenya as well as in Ghana. So I think technology is probably not the biggest challenge. It has become a great enabler, quite frankly, and being kind of an enabler of the ecosystem in the power sector. We're very encouraged by that. I think it has to come back to the execution challenge and really the real capacity to develop the human capital requirements in all of these projects. We're seeing that as a real problem now.
We're going to still stick on this theme about innovation and technology, but very quickly before I move into an ad break, Solomon, do you want to share a few thoughts on maybe some of the points Lazarus has raised?
I mean, so Lazarus talked about the efficiencies that we're able to get on the generation side with new equipment. I want to just touch on the efficiencies we're able to get on the transmission and distribution side. Because when you have aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses as high as 60%, we need to see how we can actually focus on reducing that, because that reduces the cost to the overall system. So we are seeing innovations really in terms of high voltage transmission lines where the losses are less. And then on the distribution side, we're seeing increased use of smart metering. Okay, smart metering that's able to detect what are the issues in particular, zones, and why are these things happening. Use of prepaid meters, so where you eliminate collection losses. I think that's, a very key area that allows us, even with the reduced generation supply we have in Nigeria today, to still be more effective as a power country.
I think
I really need we need to take a break right now, but Andrew, I will be coming to you after the break. We are still talking innovation in the power reforms across Africa. We'll be right back right after this break. Welcome back to Innovation Africa with General Electric. I still have a very esteemed panel of investors and people who know the power sector very well across Africa. Andrew, thank you for staying with us. I want to move to you now. We're talking about innovation and how that can be a catalyst for reforms in this power reforms we're seeing in Africa. And we're talking technology now. And I just get a sense that starting late actually could be an advantage for Africa. I want to get your thoughts on that point. The fact that we now have the opportunity to bring new technology to bear here.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important. A lot of focus when one talks about power in Africa is on the generation side. But as Solomon was saying before the break, losses between generation and consumption can amount to 50–60%. Now, if you can halve those losses, it's sort of like increasing your generation capacity by 50%. Now, that can be done a lot quicker and a lot cheaper than building new power plants. A power plant, the day you break ground, takes at least 3 years, generally speaking, to get online. Whereas reducing losses can be done a lot quicker. Now, taking it further, when you start looking at devices that, like, for example, the new fancy light bulbs that GE have, that, they don't use the same Thomas Edison incandescent ones anymore. They use the new ones that are much lower energy. So again, I'm sort of being facetious, but really, if you can also reduce the amount of consumption that you have, then that is also, in a way, removing the need to generate and supply additional electricity. It reduces the costs, and it can it can improve things quite quickly. So in that respect, I think that technology is very important to the power sector reform across Africa.
How can we harness this new technology? I mean, he talked about generation, for instance. What about distribution? The experience of GE. I know, for instance, Transcorp, we're seeing a lot more efficiency with the Ogeli power plant. I know GE is very involved in that project.
So that is a really good example to illustrate how we can, tap into new technologies to refurbish and accelerate the improvement of performance. So what you have in that case, you've got a very large install, almost 1,000 megawatts of power, producing about 100. And obviously, because of poor maintenance over a long period of time, there's not been a good activity there in terms of production of generating capacity. So what they've done is to put a very aggressive program of refurbishing the plants, what we call flange to flange, and that has allowed them to actually double their production within 3 months, and that really kind of gives a signal to what can happen now. On the top of that, because they've got a very large footprint as well, the program now is to actually develop that plant into an additional 1,000 megawatts. So you could have potentially one of the largest, generating capacity in one site. And they're going to be able to take advantage of the newest set of generating technologies, of the different types of frame machines, that will actually give them a much more efficient and much more profitable business on that side. So the technologies, again, I have to say, they're there. I think the key is how do you actually execute those here.
Right. I guess it's something that is a no-brainer for those investing in the sector. They just have to find new ways to be efficient until they can wrap up the production in the case of generators, and of course, let's move on to distributors. Okay, now I want us to switch gear a bit and move to financing. It's a big issue here. How do we finance this? And starting with the privatization, Solomon, I want you to just share some thoughts on this point. Some people are very worried about the way the investors in the Nigerian generation companies finance those acquisitions using bank loans. Some suggest that it may not be the most efficient way. Just share your thoughts on that point, financing, and how crucial it is in getting it right in the privatization of Nigeria's power sector.
So when we take a look at a lot of markets globally that have undergone power sector reform, the early financiers of the projects tend to be local. So Nigeria's development is not unique to Nigeria. Yes, a lot of the equity has been provided through some borrowings and in some cases through equity by the winning bidders. But I think ultimately if the tariff regime and the certainty of tariff increases when they are warranted, if the establishment of the baseline losses in the distribution sector are all agreed, it shouldn't be a challenge, and additional international longer-term money will come in to support really what's been done by the local financial institutions in the beginning. And this is not only lending of a long-term nature, but also potentially equity, but also strategic operators. So for example, I've spent a lot of time in China. A lot of Chinese power companies would like to come into Nigeria. So we need to solve the last mile issues. The trunk issues have been largely resolved, but we need to solve the last mile issues. And as Andrew said also, we need to focus on implementation, especially on the gas and transmission side, which tend to be the bigger risks.
Right. Andrew, Africa Finance Corporation, very involved in financing power infrastructure across the continent. Your thoughts on financing?
Well, my thoughts are actually a little bit different. I think that most such projects in Africa can get the financing as long as they're properly structured and have what is needed. I mean, today you've got actually quite a lot of people looking to invest in power projects and infrastructure projects across Africa, and what they can't find are projects that are structured in the way that they would like. So as a general comment about infrastructure in Africa, I would say that. And so in this sense, people who can in terms of human capacity and intellectual capacity, and who have the financial resources to develop projects and bring all these elements together, are actually one of the things that is missing on the continent, and is actually an area, if you're looking at potential good returns, that's actually a good area to concentrate on.
So if I hear you correctly, you're saying the expertise in structuring is something that is lacking a little bit?
The expertise it's not quite so much structuring it, because very many people can sit behind a desk and come up with a good structure. It's really, again, goes to implementation. So it's actually really bringing all these elements together, actually negotiating and agreeing a power purchase agreement, getting your fuel supply, whatever that may be, getting proper bankable EPC contracts for the construction of the power plant. And pulling all those elements together and actually really doing it, as opposed to just saying, okay, this is what it should look like.
Right.
That is what is missing. And then there's a certain amount of resources that is needed for that. Generally, development costs can be 5%, sometimes even up to 10% of the project cost of the project. Now, if you're talking about, a $500 million power plant, that could be $20–30 million in development costs. So it's not everybody that can write that kind of check, of course. So those are some of the factors, I think, that are holding back financing across the continent.
Yeah.
In Nigeria and the power privatization generally, I think, most of the financing plans that we have looked at, both the ones we've invested in and others that we haven't, generally speaking, and again, going back to what Solomon was saying, if the government and the various regulators do what they said they would do in terms of tariffs, in terms of recognizing losses, in terms of post-privatization adjustments, then those financing plans should work out. Now, it's inevitable.
Sorry, I need to jump in here because I really want to hear from Lazarus. Another aspect of this financing is vendor financing. I want you to touch on that point. Yeah. I imagine GE is involved in that to some extent.
You see, the financing of the equipment itself, which is what you're referring to here, I mean, there's sufficient money for that. There's a lot of ECAs are interested in that. It is export credit agencies. You've got banks, they're willing to do that. I think it goes back to the point as to when do you get to a project that is investable by the usual suspects of investors, right? And there's a lot of work that happens before that. The cost of doing the EIA study, the cost of doing the legal studies, the cost of doing the grid evacuation studies, on top of the fact that you need expertise to do that. All of that falls in a category of risks that the traditional investors don't look at, or they don't want to touch that. They want to see a project that is pretty much baked and ready to go. So the gap that needs to be filled is exactly what Andrew said. Yeah. Once you get to that point where you've got a project that is ready to close, I think it will have already secured the equipment financing from the source country, usually, and GE is, as an OEM, interested in selling its equipment, facilitate some of those activities, obviously working with the likes of the IFC and AFC as well. Right. So vendor financing is probably one of the easier ones to get. Yeah. The development capital is probably the hardest to get because you need to kind of take it from idea into a real project. Right,
but to get any capital at all, the policy environment will be key. Yeah. And Solomon, I'll get your thoughts on this point. Now that, especially in Nigeria, where we've seen a lot of privatization, there's a sense that, like some people have said, the center of gravity has moved to the private sector. There's a sense that the government doesn't have to be involved anymore. Is that really the case, especially in attracting financing?
No, so I mean, once again, this is what we mean by public-private partnership. It's not on the contract, it's really the partnership as it relates to sending the right signals and message as to what has been done right or what needs to be done further. So government has to be a partner really with private sector in articulating that the environment is more certain, tariffs are more certain, gas supply is resolved. So for example, I mean, with Andrew and with Lazarus, we're looking to see how we can come together to begin to solve, the gas infrastructure issues in Nigeria. So there are lots of things that, need to be done. But one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is the private sector money that's interested in infrastructure tends to have the skills and capacity. It's really the government side that doesn't oftentimes have the skills and capacity to negotiate with the private sector, where ultimately the feeling is that whatever is agreed that's bankable is not excessively in the interest of the private sector, but it's more fair and balanced. So that's the part that really needs to be built, is the capacity within government. And this capacity can be contracted. But, the commitment to contract the capacity and to use it to get to a solution that's fair and balanced is what needs to be compressed. Yeah.
All right. Let's see, get your thoughts very quickly, Andrew, on taking advantage of the rest of the world. I mean, for instance, now there's such a huge focus on power reforms in Africa, the US pledging a lot of support in that respect. Talk to us about the importance of engaging the rest of the world in transforming Africa's power sector.
Well, I think it's hugely important. We at AFC are part of the US Power Africa initiative, and we went into that mainly because we felt that, you know, as much help and assistance that you can bring into the continent, the better. But I think, you know, I guess a lot of people have gone down these routes before us, both in terms of reforming their sectors, also in terms of implementing physically electricity grids, power stations, in terms of using new technology, in terms of, you know, being EPC contractors. And, you know, frankly, there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel, to make the mistakes that they have already made, if we can learn from them. So I think it's very important to look at that. However, I should also make the point, 2 points, that local content...
I really need to interject now, because unfortunately we are really running out of time, but I'll let you start with closing statement, not the discussion. Very, very punchy indeed, because we have to wrap now. Your thoughts about innovation in Africa, power sector reforms, just some quick thoughts on what you would leave with policymakers and potential investors in this space.
Well, I think it's important to note that really it's the responsibility of governments to ensure that their citizens have adequate power. Bringing in the private sector is just a way of implementing that. So whatever they do, they need to make sure that they don't just abdicate responsibility for this. They need to make sure their reforms continue to work, and that they hold the private sector accountable for what they were supposed to do.
Right. Solomon, final thoughts?
Simplicity, certainty, it's a regulated business. You're bringing private sector in to do what governments would normally be doing. So once you create the right environment, and once again, returns are not really very high in this business, so certainty, track record of implementing decisions agreed is going to be key.
Final word from you, Lazarus.
I would say sustain the focus on the reform. I mean, it's not done. It's been a long way. There's still a lot more to go. Diversify the generation base, focus attention on the infrastructure with respect to transmission, as well as the gas to power. You know, that's a huge gap as well, and Solomon did allude to the fact that we're going to get together and try and look at that. There's a lot of technology that needs to be brought in there as well.
Right, so technology, innovation, that's what we should be telling policymakers and, of course, investors. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Of course, I've been speaking to Andrew Alli, the CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, Solomon Adegbie-Quaynor, the country manager of the IFC in Nigeria, and Lazarus Angbazo, the CEO of General Electric in Nigeria. Until next time on Innovation Africa with General Electric, it's goodbye from me, Wole Famurewa. Thank you for watching.